You're with Patrick Henningsen on today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to hour number 2 of this live broadcast here on today's News Talk. I'm Patrick Henningsen, your host. Now, let's change gears right now. We're going to go to talk about U.S. Foreign policy right now, escalation in the Middle East, another wave of airstrikes by the United States against targets in Iraq, Syria, Yemen. So the second undeclared war of aggression in just a few weeks. Pretty incredible. We'll talk right now with independent journalist based in Washington, D.C., Sam Husseini. He's joining us on the live link right now. Sam, welcome to the program.
Great to be with you, Patrick. Thank you.
It's great to have you as well. Sam, first of all, what do you make of the last 7 days? I mean, Washington says they don't want to escalate tensions while they're escalating tensions. It's pretty incredible. Your first comments on this?
Yeah, well, they clearly want to escalate tensions. They say that they don't want a wider war. What they want is dominance. And if they can't get complete subservience, they want to strike at or threaten anyone who gets out of line. They pretty much ensured that every government is subservient, right? You take a look at all of the official Arab governments. None of them are doing anything to stop Israel and the United States. That was achieved over decades of U.S. foreign policy, of regime change, of ousting anyone who looked at them the wrong way, of weakening those who they couldn't necessarily or decided not to totally take out, like Assad, for example. But anyone else who might pursue an independent path, Saddam, Gaddafi, anyone else was taken out. So that they've created this chessboard. All of these quizzling regimes now, which go along with U.S. policy, they are opposed by their publics. So the opposition to that manifests itself through these subnational groups that eventually create militias that have some kind of military component. The largest is the Houthis, but you also have Hezbollah and so on. So now, popular opposition is taking on that form, and now the U.S. is now striking at the subnational manifestations of popular opposition to its policies. I think it's important to look at that in a big picture context as to why is this happening, and obviously all of these groups have local resentments, very real, whether it's in Yemen or Iraq or Syria or whatever, but they all also galvanize around Palestine. And they rightly, I think, for the most part, see Israel as sort of the tip of the spear of the U.S. Dominance of the region.
That's an important point there, Sam, is that a lot of the hostilities, this wave of hostilities against U.S. targets in where they are encamped in Syria and in Iraq has come directly as a result of what the Israelis are doing in Gaza, the same with the actions by Ansar Allah, the Houthis in Yemen as well. But the official U.S. story right now, Sam, is that the United States is in Syria and Iraq to realize the gains in the fight against ISIS, and that these were Iranian groups or Iranian proxies that have attacked these U.S. Facilities and killed 3 U.S. soldiers. Iran is to blame, and the United States' response is to deter Iran from doing any such further belligerent activities against U.S. Interests in the region. How much of that official explanation, if I got that right, how much of that is true? How much of that is completely false?
Yeah, no, I think that official version just doesn't hold water. These groups all have volition. They all have their own agendas. Certainly, many of them are funded by Iran, but probably to a lesser extent than Israel is funded by the United States. And if anything, regarding ISIS, it's the areas where the U.S. is where ISIS is strongest. So, if anything, the U.S. has been least effective. And that's probably putting it very politely. I'm not an expert on that, but I know that much. You have the Syrian government, which has been ruthless in going after ISIS and has genuinely, gone after it. But it's the areas of Syria that it doesn't control, that the U.S. controls, that are strongest with ISIS. So I don't think any of that meaningfully holds up.
So what do you think the actual U.S. master plan is at the moment here? Do they have a master plan, or are they trying really to accommodate Israel, or is there or is it just to keep the region unstable? A lot of people are trying to figure out, what would the next move be by Washington?
Yeah, I think that a couple of things. Yeah, it's a big myth that the U.S. wants stability in the Middle East. A lot of people say that, and a lot of alleged critics of U.S. policy, even the Iranian government, said, the U.S. is making a mistake in launching these attacks. It's causing instability. And I'm like, maybe that's not a mistake. Maybe that's their goal. And it's kind of astounding that even the Iranians, apparently, at least in their public statements, don't necessarily convey that, or that they actually hold up what I believe is the mythology. The U.S. wants dominance, and it doesn't mind some military challenge at a lower level, so that it can't actually, U.S. policymakers don't care about, a handful of U.S. soldiers. I think U.S. public does, myself, other people do, but I don't think the U.S. planners care about that in the least. If anything, it's quite possible that one of the utilities of U.S. soldiers is to possibly serve as tripwires. That is, if the United States, desired at a certain point to become more interventionist in a given country, if U.S. soldiers getting killed there would serve as potentially a good pretext for further intervention if they decided to escalate that way. It's not clear to me whether they want a wider war or not at this point. They are clearly very happy to risk a wider war in order to facilitate the continuation of Israel's genocide in Gaza. That much is clear. If that risk is actually a cost to them, and it's not clear to me that that's an actual cost to them, it might be a benefit. It is significantly smaller than their enticement, their desire for Israel to continue its policies. I mean, I don't ultimately view the U.S. and Israel as completely distinct entities. There is an establishment, a nexus of the two establishments, and they work very much hand in glove and have for decades. They planned out. They've created documents, U.S. and Israeli officials, current and former, in order to secure the realm, as they called it.
Yeah, you're talking about the as well the infamous clean break document and the formation of the Project for the New American Century, another organization, major Israeli advocates, foreign policy experts, all clustering around the Beltway through various think tanks. So you're definitely correct, I think, Sam. You can't separate the two. At least you haven't been able to do that for a number of decades. We're talking before the break about about the U.S. escalation in the Middle East and the problems that it is invariably going to cause going forward. But back to the central issue, the most important core issue here is what's happening in Palestine, in Gaza. There have been some interesting developments after the interim ICJ ruling that more likely, this plausibly, Israel is engaging in genocidal activities, and this has triggered the next round of legal processes in terms of mounting a longer investigation, a possible trial. There will be a verdict at some point down in the future. But what's interesting, and I find this to be fascinating, Sam, and I want to get your analysis on this, as with Hezbollah and some of these other groups and Hamas in Gaza itself, their behavior reflects something more long term. And I see this with Hezbollah. They're very calculating in when they move, how they move, and in what proportion that they move, and the timing in which they do things. Are we seeing a similar behavior by Hamas in the wake of this ICJ ruling? Go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, it's. I think it's different in character than Hezbollah. I think Hezbollah is more calculating, and sort of. I mean, some people have been surprised that Hezbollah has not entered the war more deeply. And honestly, this isn't the main point that I want to get into here, but there has been, even among good analysts, some poor analysis in terms of Hezbollah. Amal Saad, who's typically a very good analyst expert on Hezbollah, I think has somewhat mischaracterized the history. She has argued that Hezbollah has been more engaged in this war than any prior war vis-a-vis Palestine. That's not true. In 2006, Hezbollah basically, very strategically, this was the most sophisticated thing, they interweaved effectively the Lebanese and Palestinian situations in order that created a tripwire for the 2006 war, in which Hezbollah basically beat Israel. They abducted an Israeli soldier, presumably in retaliation for Israel holding Lebanese personnel, but they did it at a time when Israel was attacking Gaza. So it was a very strategic interweaving of the two. You don't have Hezbollah doing anything like that right now. But I think right after we spoke last week, Patrick, it really caused me to really examine where Hamas has been in the last month. And if you look at it, right after a couple of days after the ICJ ruling, it became apparent that Israel was going to step up its attacks, and that they were then going to go after UNRWA. Two incredible, effective escalations in terms of their genocidal attack. And then Hamas struck Tel Aviv. And I looked back, and they hadn't struck Tel Aviv for over a month. And if you look back on it, it looks like they stopped striking central Israel right after South Africa filed the application to the ICJ. So it looks like Hamas sort of pulled back to say, let's let this play out. And also right before the ICJ issued their ruling, Hamas said, if the ICJ issues a ceasefire, we will abide by it. If they say ceasefire, we will not be the ones to break it. Israel will be the one to break it. And effectively, they didn't use the term ceasefire, but they called it for an end of genocidal activities and so on and so on. And as I said, Israel continued its bloody assault. So if you really parse through what Hamas has done, it's very interesting. And it's sort of, people tend to say, oh, it's just, this legal stuff is baloney. You just have to pursue military, or, vice versa. And I think both of those are wrong. Similarly, with the so-called Houthis, you have a similar interweaving of diplomatic, legal, and military targets. That they have said we are only targeting shipping to stop Israel from its genocidal activities against the Palestinians, and they will stop once those activities stop. So you do have an intermeshing of those things that people sometimes put in opposition to each other.
It's extraordinary what you're bringing up here, Sam, because aside from the optics, the contrast in the optics between Hamas and Israel post ICJ ruling, it shows that Hamas is conscious of other international actors, because there's a lot of stakeholders in this decision. They're conscious of it. Israel disregarding it completely. I don't know how many people have been killed since by Israel since it was over 1,100, over 1,200 people. I don't even know the numbers anymore, but it's significant. And so in international relations, Sam, you call this normative behavior. So Hamas is exhibiting normative behavior in relation to other international actors. Israel is not. Israel is acting like a rogue state. That's what the optics look like here. What your thoughts?
Absolutely. Netanyahu outright said, no one's going to stop us, not Iran, not The Hague. And meanwhile, Hamas said, we will abide by whatever the ICJ says. So the contrast is tremendous. Hamas backed the South African application, even though South Africa condemned Hamas's October 7th attack. There's all kinds of parallels there. I mean, Hamas has, I don't think a group has been talked about so much and been heard from so little in terms of what their positions are. And it reminds me a lot of in the 1990s when the U.S. was putting sanctions on Iraq after it, bombed the crap out of it, took out its water and electrical facilities and so on. Saddam Hussein couldn't do anything, basically. If he made a speech, it would get ignored or mischaracterized. He couldn't bomb. If he got bombed, then he'd get clobbered harder. And all he could do was throw out the weapons inspectors. And he would throw them out at very strategic times. If there was a conference which would bring in Israel and some Gulf states that the U.S. was trying to orchestrate, he would use that moment to kick out the weapons inspectors. Virtually nobody in the United States, maybe inside the government, they got this, but in the U.S. media, they couldn't. They never made these connections. And then after that conference was over, he'd let the inspectors back in. And in the U.S. media, this was commonly portrayed as Saddam is cheating and retreating. He's kicking them out so that he can move his weapons around, and this whole complete concoction about weapons of mass destruction, which didn't happen. That's not why he kicked out the weapons inspectors. He kicked out the weapons inspectors because you weren't listening to him or the needs of the Iraqi people. And kicking out the weapons inspectors is the only mechanism he had. Similarly, now the Palestinians, Hamas, they're totally ignored. The only mechanism Hamas has is to attack. And it's because of U.S. policy, and it's because of their complete assault on international law that there's no other method here. So now that brings us to this week. You had a Security Council meeting last week, which South Africa made some very powerful statements at. China made some fairly powerful statements. Algeria is putting forward the motions, but there was no resolution put forward. It seemed reports are that Algeria this week will put forward a resolution. One would expect that if it has teeth, that the U.S. would veto it. If it doesn't have teeth, which is probably what the U.S. wants, if they can pass a resolution that says everybody should abide by the Genocide Convention, to just totally, make it a tautological statement, I think that would be the U.S.'s first choice. And if that happens, that would signal, I think, a capitulation on the parts of these other states, a complete capitulation. That's my current reading. But if it has some meaningful teeth and the U.S. vetoes it, then you really see how serious these other states are. Will they take it to the General Assembly under Uniting for Peace? Will they suspend Israel from the UN General Assembly? Will they admit Palestine as a full member? Will they set up a tribunal to go after individuals because the International Criminal Court has refused to do its job? So that's what we're seeing this week, presumably.
Yeah, it's going to get very interesting now, you see. And Israel can be defiant and say, we're going to take care of our own security and nobody can tell us what to do and we're sovereign and all the rest of it. That's all fine and well in the initial stages of this, but now you're going to see some serious moves taking place at the UN General Assembly level, perhaps, and then there's going to be ramifications. There's going to be consequences at that point, and it can go forward for a very long time. It's going to be a very long and painful process politically for the state of Israel. And I think a lot of people are going to find that out, and probably Israel is going to find out the hard way, in fact. So it's going to be very interesting, Sam. Your final thoughts before we break.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, it's going to be a test as to the intestinal fortitude of these various states, South Africa, Algeria, and so on. Like right now, the International Court of Justice, South Africa went before them. They issued their ruling and they said, Israel's going to report back in a month. Why are we waiting a month? Israel has escalated their assault by attacking UNRWA and so on. I think that there's a strong case to be made for South Africa or other states to be going back to the ICJ sooner than that, to say, Israel is clearly not abiding and has no intention of abiding by your ruling. You need to issue another ruling, a harder ruling.
Like a cease and desist order or something like this. Yeah.
That's what happened in the case of Yugoslavia.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So this is what a lot of people were hoping for in the onset. Let's hope that the wheels of justice in this case in The Hague can turn in the right direction on this in order to save lives, in order to reduce unnecessary suffering, because that's what it's really all about at the end of the day. Journalist Sam Husseini, based in Washington, D.C., and also follow Sam Husseini's Substack as well. And also we've linked him on our @21Wire Twitter feed with our show post. Just click on there and you'll take you right to Sam's X Twitter profile, and you'll get his links there as well. Sam, thank you for joining us on TNT, Today's News Talk this week.
Thanks as always, Patrick.